She was a 62-year-old great-grandmother, 9 grandchildren, 6 great-grandchildren, a woman who looked like she belonged at a church potluck or sitting on a porch swing watching fireflies blink over a Texas summer, and on February 24, 2000, the state of Texas strapped her to a gurney and put her to death. But here's what they found buried in her yard: 2 husbands, shot in the head, wrapped in sleeping bags, hidden in plain sight under a wishing well and a backyard shed, hidden so well that one of them sat in the ground for nearly 4 years before anyone even filed a missing persons report. This is one of the most chilling cases in Texas criminal history, not because of what Betty Lou Beets did, but because of how calmly she did it, and how long she almost walked free. Welcome to Convicted Criminals. Kindly subscribe, turn on the notification bell so you won't miss our deep dive drops, and this is the story of the woman they called the Black Widow of Cedar Creek Lake. To understand what happened on a quiet August evening in 1983, you have to go back much further than that. You have to go back to a small tobacco farming community in Roxborough, North Carolina. That's where Betty Lou Dunavant entered the world on March 12, 1937. From the very beginning, her life was defined by things taken from her. When she was approximately 3 years old, she contracted measles. The illness was severe. By the time it passed, so had much of her hearing. She spent the rest of her life reading lips, navigating a world that didn't slow down to accommodate her, in an era with no hearing aids and no special education resources for children like her. Her father, James Garland Dunavant, was an alcoholic. The family eventually relocated from North Carolina to Danville, Virginia. Chasing work, James had found employment as a machinist at the Langley Research Center, but the move didn't improve life at home. By Betty's own account she would not make publicly until it was almost too late, the abuse she suffered at her father's hands began when she was just 5 years old. She alleged sexual abuse. Those claims were never tested in court during the years that mattered most. When Betty was 12, her mother, Margaret Smithwick, suffered a psychotic break and was institutionalized. Overnight, Betty was no longer a child trying to survive a chaotic home. She was the one keeping the home together. She dropped out of school and took on the responsibility of raising her younger siblings, Jimmy and Jackie, cooking, cleaning, managing what little they had, trying to shield 2 small children from a father who was rarely sober. There was no childhood left to speak of, and so, at 15, she did what many young women in desperate circumstances have done throughout history. She looked for a way out. She found it in the form of a man named Robert Franklin Branson, and she married him in 1952. She was 15 years old. He was her escape route. It didn't work. The couple had 6 children together over the course of 17 years. Their first daughter, Faye, arrived when Betty was just 16. More children followed: Connie, Shirley, Phyllis, Robert Franklin Branson II, and finally, Bobby, born in 1966. The family settled in Mesquite, Texas, but the marriage was turbulent from the beginning. Betty later claimed the relationship was abusive, though there were no police reports or documented evidence to support that during the marriage itself. What is documented is that Betty was not built for domesticity. She stayed out late, went to bars, and by the time Bobby arrived, the marriage had deteriorated beyond saving. Robert began drinking heavily. Whatever love or desperation had held them together dissolved, and in 1969, they divorced. Betty was 32 years old, 6 children, no high school diploma, nearly deaf, and heading directly back into the pattern she'd been born into. Her second husband was a man named Billy York Lane. She married him in 1970, barely a year after the divorce from Robert. This marriage would become the first documented instance of Betty Lou Beets doing something she would do again and again throughout her life: pulling a trigger when a marriage reached its breaking point. During one argument, Billy broke her nose. Betty retaliated by shooting him in the abdomen. She was charged with attempted murder, but when Billy Lane took the stand, he admitted that he had threatened her life first. The charges were dropped and Betty walked. Remarkably, the two reconciled. They remarried, only to divorce again within a matter of weeks. The relationship was over, but it had established something important. Betty Lou Beets would not absorb violence without responding to it, and she had learned something else, too, that if a man threatened her first, the law might look the other way. Her third husband was a man named Ronnie Thrill. Only months into that marriage, Betty attempted to run him over with her car. He survived. They separated but didn't officially divorce until 1979. After the split, Betty went through a period that added a misdemeanor public lewdness charge to her growing record. She was arrested after an incident at a topless bar in Dallas, where she spent 30 days in jail. By this point in her life, Betty Lou Beets had been through 2 failed marriages, a shooting, an attempted vehicular assault, a criminal record, and 6 children she had struggled to raise. She was heading into her 40s with nothing stable beneath her feet. She met her 4th husband in 1979. His name was Doyle Wayne Barker. He was tall, good-looking, a roofer who people in the community described as affable and easygoing. They settled near Cedar Creek Lake in a new trailer home outside Gun Barrel City, Texas. Betty later described him the way she described most of the men in her life, as someone who turned violent behind closed doors. She alleged he had stalked her, assaulted her, and raped her during their brief time together. The marriage lasted 7 weeks. In October of 1981, Doyle Wayne Barker disappeared. No missing persons report was ever filed. Betty simply told people he had left her. Given that Doyle had a criminal record of his own and a history of moving around without notice, nobody questioned it. He had a reputation for being hard to pin down, so when Betty said he was gone, people believed it. What they didn't know was that Doyle wasn't gone. He was still there, buried under the shed at the back of the property they had once shared. He had been shot 3 times and wrapped in a sleeping bag, hidden in the earth just steps from where Betty continued to live her life as though nothing had happened. In 1982, Betty was convicted of arson. She had set fire to her own trailer in what appeared to be an insurance fraud attempt. The details of the sentence were minimal. She remained free, and that same year, she met the last man she would ever marry. His name was Jimmy Don Beets. Jimmy Don Beets was a captain with the Dallas Fire Department. He had served the city for 26 years, earned the respect of colleagues who would later drive hours from Dallas to help search for him, and by most accounts was a well-liked, hard-working man. When he and Betty met, their courtship lasted about 6 months. In many ways, on the surface, it looked like 2 people who had both been through hard times finding something steady with each other. They married and moved into a modest home near Cedar Creek Lake, outside Gun Barrel City, Texas. Betty's son from her first marriage, Robert, known to the family as Robbie, had moved in with them. Life at Cedar Creek Lake had the texture of something calm, quiet evenings, a lake nearby, a yard with a decorative wishing well that Jimmy and Robbie had built together that summer, sweating through the Texas heat. But behind the quiet, something darker had taken hold. Betty later claimed the marriage with Jimmy had followed the same pattern as the others: alcoholism, escalating tension, violence. Whether that was entirely true, partly true, or a story constructed after the fact, the jury that ultimately heard her case never got to weigh it, because on the evening of August 6, 1983, Betty Lou Beets made a decision, and she made it coldly. Robbie was in the house that night. Jimmy was half asleep in his recliner, the television flickering in the dim room. At some point during the evening, Betty pulled her son aside and told him she was done with Jimmy, done with the marriage, done with it all, and then she told him something else, something that stopped him cold. She said Jimmy had to die that night. Then she told him to leave, no explanation, just go, and Robbie did. He stepped out of that house and closed the door behind him. What happened next took only seconds. Betty walked into the room where Jimmy sat slumped in his chair. She raised a .38 caliber pistol. She fired twice. Both rounds struck him in the head. Jimmy Don Beets never made a sound, never woke up, never had the chance to react. He died in that recliner while the television played on. When Robbie returned to the house 2 hours later, Jimmy's body was exactly where it had fallen. Betty stood in the room, calm in a way that didn't fit the moment. She didn't cry, she didn't explain. She looked at her son, and Robbie looked at her, and at the body, and then at her again. And then she said the words that would haunt him for the next 2 years: "Help me get rid of the body." And he did. Out in the front yard was the wishing well, the decorative brick structure he and Jimmy had built just months before. Together that night, Betty and Robbie wrapped Jimmy's body in a sleeping bag, lowered him into the well, sealed it with bricks, and poured concrete over the top. When they were finished, the yard looked undisturbed, ordinary, just a quiet home near a lake, with a wishing well in the front yard, but Jimmy Don Beets was underneath it.